All right, so chapter 9, lesson 2 is all about the history of North Africa. And we begin about 8,000 years ago when people began to settle around the Nile River. The Nile, like a lot of the other rivers that we've talked about, flooded regularly. And this is going to be great for farming. You can see that there's kind of a greenish area around the path of the river, and that's forming an area where farming could take place. And then at the mouth of the river, where it empties into the Mediterranean, is the delta. And so a lot of sediment is deposited there, making for really good farmland. So there was lots of reason that people could settle there because it could be supported by agriculture. So about 5,000 years ago, kingdoms started to develop. The Egyptian kingdoms that you probably learned about already at some point in school. We know that they were led by pharaohs who were kings. They were mostly men, but there were a few female pharaohs over time. They often used slave labor, but then the labor of their people as well to farm, but also to build these tombs, the pyramids. One thing that I often like to point out to students is that what we see of these pyramids is not exactly what they would have really looked like, because if you look at this back pyramid here, and I believe these are the Great Pyramids at Giza, which are kind of the most famous ones, but if you'll notice the top of this right here, there's like a part of it up here that looks different from the rest, and that's because that's what it would really look like. It's like a special cover stone that existed, but because of the harsh desert climate, it's eroded all the rest of it. So what we see left behind, I mean, it pretty much is, but they would have been smooth. Like it almost looks like you could climb up the pyramids, and you probably could to some degree because there's these like individual blocks, but originally they would have been smooth. Think like the face of a wall would be smooth, and it's kind of the same way with those. So kind of interesting. Egypt doesn't have a lot of can't produce a lot outside of what could be grown near the river. But that eventually, Egypt would control areas that would produce things like gold and ivory, and they could trade for some of those things. It also talks about myrrh down here. I don't know what exactly the Egyptians used myrrh for. I know in other cultures it would be used in the burial, so I don't know if they used it for mummification as well. But it says here that they had some of that they controlled. They were polytheistic, so they believed in many gods. You'll learn about some of those in class. The sun god Ra was one of the most important, and in fact, like the pharaoh is considered like to be like an incarnation of the sun god. So their rule really went because they were speaking on behalf of God. They also believed in life after death, which is the reason they built those pyramids, and only really the rich could be put in those. Regular people were just buried in the ground. But the process of mummification at first was very expensive, and I think over time, more and more people, if they were just wealthy and not the pharaoh, could afford to do it. But they're kind of most famous for these pyramids. There's some videos here that you could watch a little bit later. We're not going to do that right now. There were multiple kingdoms that existed. There was like the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom that existed in Egypt because they existed for a long period of time. And part of the reason we know so much about the Egyptians is because we have artifacts that have been left behind, and their system of writing called hieroglyphics, which is only one of their types of writing. They also had like a demotic script, which was another like more, I think it would be used in like transactions for trade and things like that. Hieroglyphics were much more formal writing that we have record of today, with finding it on the tombs of these pharaohs. And often I think we're kind of under slavery is a big part of ancient Egypt. Even some of that comes from what is in the Bible and Jewish history with the Exodus. But I think many of the pyramids were actually built by the Egyptian people themselves, not their slaves. Um, just because the people felt, they were building this thing for the incarnation of a god that they worshiped. So they were all eager to work to assemble that. Here we can kind of see some of the hieroglyphics on the walls. The dry climate also meant that things could be preserved really, really well. So today, you can go into some of the tombs and the pyramids and see those things. One thing that I don't really feel like is in the notes that I often like to point out too is that over the centuries there was lots of wealth in there. So when these pharaohs were buried, they were buried with lots of wealth for the afterlife, and there were many grave robbers over time that would take those things out. So much of what would have been left in the tombs was not actually there. Some of the things that they have been able to find were these jars, which would hold the organs of people. They would take almost all organs out except for the heart, I believe. They left that in. They would take the brain out and they would take it out through the nose without making any kind of incision. So kind of gross process. But they believed that all these organs had to be, I guess, preserved in these jars. This right here is about King Tut, and what you're seeing here is a gold mask. They call this the death mask. So this would have been placed over his mummified body. And as far as I know, it's the only one that's ever been discovered. King Tut's tomb is part of the reason what makes him so famous. He was only a boy king that lived for a very short period of time. He didn't really do a lot of incredible things. There's a lot of other pharaohs that are known for much more achievements, but his tomb was kind of like accidentally discovered, and it had never been raided by grave robbers. So everything that was in there was everything that the Egyptian people put in there long ago. So I feel like that's part of the reason that he is so famous, is because we have a preserved tomb that was discovered. And I believe that death mask is in the Smith. It may not be in the Smithsonian. I was thinking it was, but it may be in a museum in Egypt. But it is extremely famous and pretty much priceless because it's solid gold and really, really old. So the Egyptian people also were well known for use of mathematics, being able to figure things like taxes, astronomy, and the study of the stars. To be able to build the pyramids, you had to be able to know math and science really, really well. This is the Sphinx, which you may have seen. It's like a head of a person and the body of a cat. It was also a tomb of one of the pharaohs. Also, ancient Egypt had a collection of writing and works from antiquity, so anything from the ancient times, and they were held in a library at Alexandria. And eventually, the Egyptians are going to be conquered by the Romans, and that library was destroyed at that time. And that was kind of a very well-known event in history because there were many things that we only had, or the Egyptians only had one copy of. So maybe some of the most ancient literary works or other things, and much of that was destroyed and then never recovered. So a major loss for the state of history, that maybe we would have some of those things today if this library was not destroyed. Kind of fast forwarding a little bit here in time, there's the people of Carthage, which were in North Africa, so it's kind of separate. They were in the area of kind of like Tunisia to Morocco, and they were important because they had this war against Rome, but Rome eventually defeats them, and I think they just completely destroyed and left pretty much no survivors in there. So the people of Carthage are kind of well known for fighting against the Romans. Kind of moving on here, the Ottomans are going to come in at some point, but Islam moves into this area, and even today, I mean, much of North Africa, the people practice Islam. Yeah, so by 705, the Muslims ruled all of North Africa, And then there were these caliphs that held control, but they had trouble keeping control there. It talks about the Berbers here. That's one of the other ethnic groups in this area. There's mainly like Arabs, which are most of the people of North Africa, Berbers, and Egyptians. Those are kind of like the three major cultural groups that exist there. This is showing Arabic, which is the language mostly spoken and read in North Africa. But Islam kind of held is the main religion practiced there even today. The Ottomans were also Islamic as well, and they held control in the 1500s of this area. And then we get to an important part, because this is going to be very true of much of Africa, and that's the Europeans to come and take control. So you can see France and Italy held control of parts of North Africa. Egypt remained free, but then the Suez Canal was built, and Britain basically comes in and tries to take control, and really does have control of that. And then so it wasn't until the 1950s that some of these areas began to break free, but they're going to just really struggle. Their economies are going to struggle. They're going to have weak governments, which is going to lead to some other problems that we'll see here in a moment. So many of them fought for independence and became independent over time. But one of the problems that you'll see kind of that shows up is that with the weak government that kind of happens after the Europeans leave, it gives rise to certain dictators. And so one of these guys is named Muammar al-Gaddafi, and he was the leader of Libya. He led for like 40 years, and he had a really ruthless rule of the people. I don't have a picture of him here, apparently. But he ruled for a long period of time. And this slide just talks about how there were other leaders and plagued by unrest in certain countries. Because of some of these problems, high population growth, it gave rise to Muslim fundamentalists who wanted the government to follow strict Islamic law and reject Western influences that come from Europe or the United States. And so that gives rise around 2010 to the Arab Spring. It was a series of protests that happened in many of these countries, were trying to return more to those fundamental Islamic ideals. So there was lots of rebellion. Gaddafi was killed in 2011 in Libya. So that was kind of one of the events of the Arab Spring. So there's kind of a lot packed in here. I mean, a lot of it's about ancient Egypt. So ancient Egypt built one of the first and earliest libraries, but it was also the first country to gain independence. They were polytheistic. The ancient Egyptians were, at least. The pharaohs had these tombs, and they had a belief in the life after death. Hieroglyphics were their system of writing. Islamic rule had a great impact on North Africa. Greater impact on North Africa than Roman rule. The followers of Islam ruled over North Africa by 700 CE. Carthage fought 3 wars with the Roman Empire for control of much of North Africa. So knowing Carthage is important. And many foreign nations wanted control of Egypt to have access to the Suez Canal, and Britain would be the one that could take control of that. And then Gaddafi was the dictator of Libya for 40 years. And then this last one, I can't really see it because of my screen here. So many Europeans fled from Algeria after it gained independence, just because of all the fighting that happened there. So if you will please write these things down in your notes, that will be what you'll need to have. Remember, that'll be a grade again at the end of this unit. So thank you for watching.